Thank you. Hello. Let's see if I can. There we go. Can you hear me okay? All right. So I'm glad that you all turned out tonight to come hear a talk on chemistry, because I'm sure you had nothing better to do on a Friday night. I'm delighted to be here. When I was thinking about it, when I was a little girl, I used to go out in the backyard and dig with a spoon. And my mom told me if you dig far enough, you can get to the other side of the world. And I used to work at it for hours and wonder what is on the other side of the world. And I always loved science since I was a little girl, and I grew up to study science and now talk about science. And I was thinking when I was flying over the Pacific Ocean a few days ago, coming to Australia for the first time, that I never did finish my digging, but it's so wonderful to be able to traverse this globe full of the science that I love and come to the other side of the world, to Australia, and meet people. And what's even better is that no matter where I go to the ends of the earth, I can go to a Catholic Mass, and it's the same prayers, it's the same liturgy. It's a beautiful thing. What I'm going to talk about tonight is how, in science even, everything fits together. And in our faith, it all fits together too. We're all in all of this together, this planet, this life. And it's exciting. And this is part of the new evangelization, to be able to talk about science in a way that deepens our faith. Do I have, whoops. We'll get to that in 1 second. So the title of my book and also the title of the talk is Particles of Faith. And it's about the new evangelization. It's about being able to talk to people today in this scientific age that we live in about our faith. It's way more than explaining to people why you can be Catholic and study science. It's way more than explaining there is no conflict between faith and science. It's going beyond that and getting out in front of it and leading people to Christ through science. And that's a radical thing. You don't hear a lot of people talk about that. But I want to take you on this journey, sort of in the world the way I see it. I have been handing these things out for a couple of years now, thousands of chemistry glasses. And you're the first people in Australia to get these chemistry glasses. So I'm going to ask you to keep them with you for the rest of your life. I'm a big believer that if you're going to stand up and talk to people, it's got to be life-changing. Otherwise, sit down and stop talking. So I want this to change the way that you see the world. To understand the world of a chemist, you have to be able to use your imagination a great deal. I have never seen an atom. I know some scientists have with microscopes, strong enough scanning electron microscopes. I've never actually seen an individual atom. I've never seen an electron, but I have worked with those things and manipulated those things to build better living through chemistry like we did at DuPont. So you have to be able to have a very active imagination. And so that's what we're going to exercise tonight, is your imagination, to take you down into this world that God created. It's kind of like seeing a rainbow for the first time. You could get to the end of your life and never see a rainbow, and you would be able to live a good life. But it would be sad that you never saw that beauty. And so I want to take you into this world of beauty of chemistry quickly. In 10 minutes, I'm going to explain all of chemistry, physics, and biology to you before I tell you how to evangelize through science. But you have to have an active imagination, starting now. So I had installed above all your heads in this new theater, no food, I had installed a box with a gift in it for you. And so I'm going to need you now. You can close your eyes if you want to, or you can just reach up. Reach up and open that little box. Go ahead. Open it. Now reach inside. and take out your brand new spanking pair of chemistry glasses and put them on. And you can have these for the rest of your life, and you can keep them with you at all times. I never take mine off, which is why sometimes they say scientists are like nerds, because we are thinking about reactions, and we're thinking about things at this atomic level, just clicking away in our minds. But let me take you down into this world. I've got to use pictures to explain it. This is Beaver Stadium at Penn State University in Pennsylvania, where I went to graduate school. It seats 110,000 people. It's a very big stadium. And I want you to imagine that that is an atom. That is our atom. Let me get my... Okay? In the middle of this space, this big giant stadium, suspended right in the dead center of the space, not on the field, but up in the air, I want you to imagine one of those little glass marbles. That is our nucleus. In the nucleus of an atom are protons and neutrons. Protons are positively charged, neutrons are neutral, because if you break them apart, you get a neutron and an electron, which is negatively charged. That matter is dense in the nucleus. All the rest of the space, which is why they say atoms are mostly empty space, are the electrons, which are negatively charged. Now, a proton, just to drag you down into this size realm, a proton is 1.6726219 times 10 to the negative 24th grams, okay? You can't put them on a balance and measure them, but I have a t-shirt that says, protons have mass. Yes, they do. They had other ways of determining it besides putting them on balances. My shirt says, protons have mass. I didn't even know they were Catholic, but they are. Okay, now, with your chemistry glasses on, understanding this is basically how we conceive of the atom today. It's a big space with electrons whizzing around outside there. We'll get to those in a minute. In that marble in the center, that very dense, tiny center of this atom, are the protons and neutrons. A proton is this big. Imagine a sugar cube. Okay, does everybody know what a sugar cube is? Like, I don't really see them very much anymore, but it's about 4 grams. Cut the sugar cube in half with your imagination. Just cut it in half, throw away 1/2. That's about 2 grams. Take that sugar cube now, and with your imagination, this is where you'll need your glasses, cut it into 1 billion pieces. Okay? Got that? Go ahead, like try to imagine 1 billion pieces. Now I want you to throw away all but 1. Take that little billionth of 1/2 of a sugar cube and cut it into another 1 billion pieces. Okay? Can you see it? You can't. The human mind cannot, which is why we use scientific notation. Cut that billionth into 1 billion pieces. Okay, throw all the other pieces away, keep that one. Now, one more time. Cut that into only 1 million pieces. Okay. That little tiny particle is about 2 times 10 to the negative 24th grams. It's a little bigger than a proton. That millionth of a billionth of a billionth of 1/2 a sugar cube is what we're talking about for the protons. The neutrons are about the same size. The electrons whizzing around out here, that's a whole nother story. That's quantum mechanics. The electrons are not just plum pudding whizzing around in no particular place randomly. They are in quantized energy levels in certain orbitals, which were figured out by quantum mechanics and made me break a lot of pencils in college trying to derive those equations. The electrons are in their quantized spaces, quantum mechanics. And the electron, this is a really cool fact, the electron is about 2,000 times smaller than that proton I just had you cut up. 2,000 times smaller. And you say, why 2,000? Well, it's actually 1,846, 1 over 1,846. That's the size of an electron relative to a proton, 1/2000th almost. Scientists have done calculations with this, and if the electron had been only, say, 500 times smaller instead of almost 2,000, the electron would have been so massive that even though it has a negative charge of the same amount as the positive charge on the proton, it wouldn't have stayed in its quantized orbitals. It would have eventually crashed into that marble in the center of our atom here. And we would not be sitting here today talking about atoms and chemistry classes, because atoms would have never formed back in the beginning of time. The universe is precisely tuned down to even that. So when we get to this thing called the periodic table, which is cause for joy, great joy, when we get to the periodic table, this is the periodic table of the elements. These are, a single piece of an element is an atom. These atoms, these God's Legos, the little building blocks, these atoms all have one successively more protons in the nucleus. Hydrogen has 1 proton, helium has 2, lithium 3, beryllium 4, and so on and so on. And there are no missing spots. Scientists expected this order, and they went out and they found so much order among the elements that there were missing spots, and they predicted they would find the element with that many protons, and they did. And they predicted the properties. But the periodic table is lined up that way. These elements comprise everything on planet Earth. Your body is made up of some of these elements. Where did they come from? So if we go back about 14 billion years to our prevailing cosmological theory, which we heard in the Mass, the Big Bang tells us, and our theories could change over time, but for now, it tells us that the first stars didn't form for about 400 million years. In that time, the atoms were forming, the electrons getting in their place around the nucleus. But it was only hydrogen, that first element. When the stars form, a star is hydrogen. And hydrogen fuses, the nuclei fuses with the protons to make the next element, which is helium, 2 protons. It just so happens that helium is more stable and can hang around for a while. So you have in stars, like our sun, you have hydrogen burning. You have the hydrogen combining, fusing, nuclear fusion, to form the next element, which is helium. But something curious happens here. As the stars are burning and forming helium, which is kind of stable, you have a situation where you have the 2 proton element and the 1 proton element in the same star, and they start to fuse. That's how you get lithium. But helium's still there, and so it will fuse again, and you get the 4th element. And if you keep going, you get beryllium, and some helium is still hanging around, and when you add 4 and 2, you get carbon. And if you add 4 and 1 more hydrogen, you get nitrogen. And if you add 4 and another 4, you get oxygen, which is 8. In secular science textbooks, it says this: there is a curiously high abundance of the elements necessary for life on Earth in the whole universe. And so it's amazing how all those things formed, and how it just so happens that what is necessary for life in the universe. But what are we talking about? The universe. As we understand the Big Bang and the expanding universe, you see all these little spirally things out here? These are galaxies that started to form. We live in the Milky Way galaxy. Our sun, which is a star burning helium, burning hydrogen to make helium, that's where all the energy comes from. Our sun is just one of these little tiny specks Okay, so that's mind-blowing too. We have gone from a millionth of a billionth of a billionth of a half a sugar cube for the size of a proton up to a galaxy. In the observable universe, there are hundreds of galaxies. In our galaxy where we live, there are hundreds of other stars, other suns. And in our little, rather indistinct sun out here that's just sitting on an arm of this spiral in the galaxy is where the planets, our solar system, formed at some point. We think about 4 billion years ago. As dust coming off of the star started to form these solar nebulae, and they started to orbit around the sun, it condensed into rocks, which established themselves in their own orbits, which are due to gravity, and formed the solar system. And that third rock out from the sun happens to have just the right balance of distance from the sun, heat, and elements to give us life. So when you think about it that way compared to the way people used to think about our position in the universe, without faith, it's almost scary to think that you're existing. Like, how come you're existing? Like, what happens if your electrons decide not to orbit around the atoms in your body anymore? Poof, and you just disappear. You really start to think about your own existence in a deeper, different way. And indeed, that's what scientists do. Scientists, I think they all come to a point where they have to ask that bigger question, who did all of this? Which is what led me to faith, because there is no human explanation for what we find in science. But just to give you an idea of how much we rely on the stability of the universe in these atoms, the second, about that much time itself, we base it on an atom. We base it on these hyperfine oscillations of the ground state electron in the cesium-133 atom. That little electron jiggles in its orbital. It jiggles 9,192,631,770 times for a second. That's how we define a second. And it jiggles that reliably, that repeatably, that scientists can measure the radio waves coming off from that jiggling of that electron. And when you have your watches that are set to the atomic clock, that's what they're talking about. As the story goes, moving into biology now, it's a reasonable thing for scientists to have asked, how did life on this planet come to be? And notice, nowhere in here do we have to deny the existence of God. If anything, it's all pointing to a creator who is faithful. The theory, this is called the primordial soup that get asked a lot about, talking about faith. But all the scientists mean by that is, how did these elements that were on the planet before life arose, how did they come to give us life? Well, there are some theories. Going back to about the same time when quantum mechanics developed, around the 1930s, Alexander Oparin had this scientific theory that, he was a Russian biochemist, that life began in the oceans with the sun, the energy coming from the sun, the hydrogen fusing into helium, and lightning, which would be the electricity, and heat. And that he said that triggered chemical reactions in the oceans, which are like big beakers, and that small organic molecules would have had to have formed. So that was 1930. In 1953, two American scientists, Stanley Miller and Harold Urey, and their names are pretty well known for doing this, they simulated Oparin's experiment. They actually put what would have been in the early universe and the early Earth, in that 4 billion years before life started. Well, there was 1 billion year before life started to form on Earth. We think the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old itself in a 14 billion year old universe. what would have been there? Looking at the elements that are in the earth now, there would have been nitrogen, like we were saying on the periodic table, oxygen, hydrogen, and carbon. Carbon dioxide, nitrogen gas, ammonia, methane, which is CH4, and hydrogen gas. And they tried this experiment in the 1950s. They put these small molecules into a beaker to simulate an ocean with water in it. And they shine light on it, and they zapped it with some electricity. And indeed, they found that some amino acids formed. So that's all they're talking about when they say, could life have arisen from this primordial soup? In 1965, another scientist, Sidney Fox, even showed that if you keep heating that solution, the amino acids start to link together and form cell membranes. So this is again, I say prevailing theory, because theories can always change as our understanding of the world changes. This is what they mean when they say life might have arisen. And notice, nowhere in there did I have to say God didn't have a hand in it. God's holding it all in existence. It's just the chemical explanation. And that, to continue on with this awesome story, keep your chemistry glasses on to look at this. Okay? You're still with me? To continue on in this awesome story of creation, nature is creation, we get to something called photosynthesis. And so this is the explanation how, as these early small molecules became amino acids and the amino acids became proteins, and these things started to form, many years go by, over the eons, photosynthesis is the explanation for how oxygen gas got to be on this planet. We kind of need that to breathe, right? And the explanation of this gets even wilder. As sunlight is streaming down on the planet from the hydrogen fusing to make helium, in the leaves out there on any tree, go look at any tree, in every square millimeter, so we're talking a lot bigger than a proton, but pretty small, in every square millimeter, there's 500,000 or so of these organelles called chloroplast. And if you go into the chloroplast, there's these little pancake structures called the thylakoid. And if you go into the membrane of the thylakoid, there are proteins that orient these chlorophyll molecules and the complexes that you see here at just the right angstrom, which is 1/10 of a nanometer spacing, so that they can capture energy from the sun in the form of a photon, a packet of energy. And when this photon hits the chloroplast molecule, an electron gets excited. And that electron, just to guide you through some of this, when that photon causes an electron to leap out of the chlorophyll molecule, it goes into this dual system of electron transfer pathways called the Z scheme of photosynthesis. In this diagram, we have photosystem 2. The electron goes to a bound plastoquinone, to a pool of plastoquinone molecules, to another plastoquinone before the electron moves on to a plastoquinol molecule and pumps protons into the thylakoid lumen that's inside the membrane, and goes on to a plastocyanin, which reduces or gives an electron to a cytochrome BF5 complex. I'm not done with this one. To a cytochrome BF5 complex. And then that little PC down here, that plastocyanin, reduces another photooxidized chlorophyll molecule in photosystem 1. And then there's yet another system of electron transfer pathways that goes through the membrane, ferredoxins. And you have this building up of protons in the thylakoid lumen, which supplies the energy for the nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate to be changed into NADPH+, which supplies the energy for adenosine diphosphate to take a phosphate donor group and form adenosine triphosphate. And that's just the light reactions. And then we have this other pathway called carbon fixation, which takes the carbon dioxide, which we are breathing out and which was present in the early universe, in the early Earth. It takes carbon dioxide and through this other elaborate system of chemical reactions, changes it into this 3-carbon precursor, which goes on into planet Earth to make all the rest of the biomass. And so when I was doing graduate research, I was trying to simulate that. And that's one of the things that brought me to my knees and said, maybe there's a better chemist than any human. Because what photosynthesis does on the planet is it uses 6 times more energy than the entire global human population. And it converts that sunlight into quintillion kilojoules of energy and makes some 100 billion tons of biomass. By biomass, I mean all the living things. That sunlight goes to the tree, to the chloroplast. It gets converted into the 3-carbon precursor, which makes the trunk, the other leaves, the stems, the roots, which get eaten by animals, which get eaten by other animals, gets into that food chain. And so all the biomass comes literally from sunlight, breath, and water. Here's the rest of that slide. But isn't that cool that what we understand about the atom led us to understand about the universe and how it's all interconnected? And when I go on Instagram and I get a new follower, or on LinkedIn, or on Facebook, or on Twitter, and I get a new follower, sometimes people say to me, Stacy, it's so great to be connected. And I'm like, well, let me tell you. We are all connected in very precise ways at the atomic level. And we are, because the air you're breathing right now, you're breathing in gas molecules that have been bumbling around this planet, and before that, this universe, in places God literally only knows. Only God could know where. And then when you breathe out, you're releasing more molecules to go on into the air and do their thing. It kind of freaked my kids out when I told them that, because they're like, I don't want to be that connected with people. But it really is amazing that these chemical processes happen so reliably, and that when we look, I've heard it put before, when we look up at the stars, it's literally the elements that came from the stars looking back at the stars. But we understand all of that, of course, because we're human persons, body and soul. This is a DNA molecule. So somewhere in the 1950s, Francis Crick was credited with discovering the helical structure of the DNA molecule. Notice that DNA is made of those elements that there is a high abundance of in the universe. And all they do is click together the way that their electrons tell them to do. The electrons whizzing around that proton at Beaver Stadium with the glass marble, there are very precise rules about what elements can bond with other elements. 2 atoms bond if the electron on one kind of likes the positive charge on the other, and so it decides to go around both. And that's when you get a chemical bond. But there are only certain atoms bond with other atoms. There are very precise rules to this. And that's why the DNA molecule twists the way it does. This is also why we understand a code in the DNA. The code in DNA, the 3 nucleotide code that we have, are like words. And we say that the code in the DNA is like a language, the language of God. It's like it tells our proteins how to form. The DNA is why your hair is the color it is. It's why your eyes are the color they are. It's why you have a whole lot of characteristics, of phenotypes in your body that is following the genetic code that you have. It's why when you spit in the test tube for 23andMe and you get your DNA, your genome known to you, they can look at it and compare it back to ancestors and figure out, who's related to whom. Whenever there's a genetic mutation, there's just some change in this code for whatever reason. And that little bit of a change can cause a different phenotype. And that's what we talk about when we talk about evolution. A segment of DNA is called a gene. It's a certain segment that codes to make the proteins that gives a certain trait that we can see in the living organism. And evolution is nothing more than change. Evolution is, if you go to a population of kangaroos, for example, and you're looking at all the ones that have a certain color of eyes. I have no idea what color a kangaroo's eyes are. Are they brown? If you're looking at a certain trait, you can get a sample from the animals, take it back to the lab, do the genome, and you can say, okay, this trait happened 50% for trait A, another 25% for trait B, another 25% for trait C. If you go back 10 years later, after some generations have passed in the population, and you measure the same, the same space, the same plot of land, you measure the population again, and you notice that the frequency of the gene that the 3 genes you're looking at have changed. There's less of A, more of B, more of C. That's what they call evolution. It's just looking for genetics that change over time in a population. It's not for individuals, it's for a whole population of whatever organism, plant, or animal that you're looking at. And so it's just change. And it all does come down to the electrons. That's why I didn't become a biologist, because you just memorize stuff. I'm sorry if there are any biologists out there. And if you're a physicist, you're just trying to explain why things move the way they do. It's really all about trying to understand the atom. The atom is underneath all the biology. And physics is helping us understand, quantum physics is helping us understand the atom. But this is how we get the diversity of life. So back to big numbers and playing around with them with our chemistry glasses on, that DNA changing in a population over time like that led to different traits, and it led to biodiversity. That's a busy plot right there. The point is, for every line you see, that's about 500 different species that have been tabulated by scientists. So that's the biodiversity, and it came about from changes in the genetics. And then, so I put all of this together about the atom, the universe, evolution, to get to the most troubling thing that we talk about today, which is human evolution. The church teaches that we can study the evolution of the body. We can never deny that God created everything, but how could you when you look at science this way? We can't deny that God created everything in the beginning of time. That was revealed to us. The Big Bang notwithstanding, which makes some mathematical assumptions about what could have happened, but even scientists today talk about what happened before the Big Bang. The Big Bang has a theory about the beginning, but it doesn't really talk about the origin of everything. That had to be revealed to us by God. Science can't prove that God created everything. It points to God. And so we can't deny that God created everything in the beginning. We can't deny that the human person is body and soul. And the soul is immaterial, which means the soul doesn't do the electron atom thing. The soul is immaterial. It's not made of elements. It doesn't evolve. But the body can, and for all we can tell by looking at the fossils, did evolve. But the neat thing about it is really neat when you step back and look at science in this big view like we're doing here, and you start to look at what scientists are coming up with. The Big Bang is certainly consistent with the idea, what was divinely revealed, that God created everything in the beginning. It's consistent with the beginning. The more that is known about human evolution, the more that scientists start to ask questions about how did we become intelligent. We understand that as a faculty of the rational soul as Catholics. But even evolutionary scientists, when they look at neuroscience, evolution, genetics, linguistics, computer science, and they put it all together, there was a book written by I think he's even an atheist, Noam Chomsky, that said, you know what? Human language could have come about in a single individual. It could have arisen by a single genetic mutation that could have led to human language. And so they're studying human language, and they're noting that the way humans communicate is drastically different than the way any animals communicate. We know that, right? Like, we already know that as humans, because we are created in the image and likeness of God with the faculties of intellect and free will. But even looking at the evolutionary record, there seems to be a single language, the arising of language, the evolution of language in the human species could be attributed to a single genetic mutation in a single individual. And it's a kind of communication, not just like dogs barking at night, but a communication whereby we put abstract thoughts together and we communicate abstractly. We write scientific papers. And that, what the scientists were saying and the philosophers were saying, is that before that kind of language could have come about, there had to be the thought. You had to have the thought first. And so really and truly, the more they study this stuff, which they should study it, the more it is telling us about our own bodies. And as long as you remember that God created everything and the human is body and soul, rational soul, created in the image and likeness of God, and that we're stewards over this planet of elements, the more you can be comfortable with studying the science and see what it has to show. Because I do think, besides the point of evangelizing through science, science can help us understand theology better too. You have to remember, though, with your chemistry glasses on, we feeble humans are but looking at God's handiwork. We are looking at what God has created and trying to figure it out. All this stuff that we just covered, that's hundreds of years worth of arguing and debating and theorizing and experimenting by scientists. And let me tell you something, we are not done. There is no scientist today who could sit down right now and write out on a whole bunch of paper, not even a single sheet, but not even a whole ream of paper. There's no scientist today who could write out every single chemical equation that has to happen for your heart to beat one more time. The human body, any living thing, but especially the human body, it's beyond our comprehension that it even exists, that we are existing right now. God knows all those chemical reactions because He created them. God knows where all the electrons are and all their orbitals and every atom in your whole body. God knows where the gas molecules go when you breathe them out. God knows where they came from when you breathed them in. That's what it means to know everything. That's part of what it means. And so, here's me understanding the science before I became Catholic. And it was not that hard to say, okay, there's probably a God when you understand science like that. When I was writing Particles of Faith, I was trying to figure out, though, what is the one line? Because in this age of social media, you just kind of need a tagline to say everything you want to say. And I was thinking about it one day, and the book is dedicated to JJ. This is my son. He was 4 here in this picture. He's 8 now. But how do we understand science as Catholics? He had heard me talking about atoms, because I tend to do that a lot around the house. I've taught chemistry. And he grew up, all my kids grew up hearing me talk about atoms. But it clicked with him one day, and he was like, wait, Mom. He was looking at his arm. He's like, are you telling me that my arm is made of atoms? And I was like, yeah, JJ, it is. Your arm is made of a whole bunch of atoms that are clicked together to make the proteins that make the skin, and then there's more atoms that make the bones, and there's blood flowing. There's a whole lot going on just in that little piece of your arm. And he was blown away by that. But he went on like this for months and months and months, throwing things at the wall in the living room. JJ, stop throwing things. Mom, I'm just smashing atoms. And he would go up to trees and poke at them. Is this made of atoms? But he was looking around at the world. Are those clouds made of atoms? Is the air I'm breathing made of atoms? Is this water made of atoms? And we started talking about all of that. And there was one night when I was with JJ alone. I have 7 children, and everybody else was out of the house. It was just me and my youngest child, JJ. And he was eating his favorite dinner, spaghetti and meatballs. And I asked him to say the prayer by himself. As an aside, I learned to do that as a mom, but when his older sister, the next youngest child, who she's one of 4 sisters in the house still, I asked her to pray one night by herself so I could know that she knew the words, and she had been praying her whole life, "Lead us not into the station," in the Our Father. And so it's probably a good idea to have these little ones pray alone without the bigger ones sometimes. So I asked JJ to say the prayer, and he said, okay. So he's sitting there with his big plate of spaghetti and meatballs, and he says, "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Bless us, O Lord, and these thy atoms, which we are about to receive from thy bounty through Christ our Lord, amen." And I said, that is it right there. Out of the mouth of that child is everything any Catholic needs to do about understanding faith and science. God gave us the intellect, God gave us the will, but just like we look at our table of food, which is chemical processes, cooking is chemistry, just as we look at our table of food and we say, thank you, God, for all of this. Thank you for these gifts. Thank you for this bounty. Thank you for all of this. We pray to God and we say thank you for it, and then we eat it. We don't pick through it and figure out what proves God exists and what doesn't prove God exists. We don't say the Brussels sprouts are proof of suffering and there could be no God. We don't say that the lasagna over here is so highly ordered there must be a God. We start with faith. And I am saying that you have to understand science, you have to start from a position of faith. One of my books is called Science Was Born of Christianity, and it was that worldview that God created everything. In the beginning, God created everything. In the beginning was the Word. A universe this ordered is only befitting a creator like the Holy Trinity revealed to us, a rational, loving creator who created the world for us, our home. It only makes sense. Science has only proven that. So that's how we go about science. There's a whole lot of debates that could be spared if we just remembered that we start with faith, we look out at the world, and we say thank you to God. And so that is the point. You don't even have to read the book if you don't want to, but if you like your chemistry glasses, you might enjoy the book. Science is the study of the handiwork of God. Creation, nature is creation. All of this is creation. If our theories change over time, it's because we didn't understand very much. We are understanding more and more every day as scientists, but we don't know everything. We are so far from knowing everything, but we are probing the universe to understand more and more. And science is the study of the handiwork of God. What's the significance of this? And see the little dedication for JJ? You know the story about that now. It gets us back to what we learned as little kids preparing for First Communion. This is the St. Joseph Baltimore Catechism. Do y'all know what this is? It's the first thing that I sat down with and read with my children. And it starts out on page 1, lesson 1, God made everything out of nothing. God made us. Of course, JJ said atoms. But the neat thing about teaching that to children is that he was then 6, with a 6-year-old child, I had a very sophisticated discussion about Aristotelian, Thomistic, secondary, and first causes. God made me out of nothing. JJ said God made me out of atoms. That's true, but atoms are changing. God made the atoms. There's a first cause. But all of this, when we talk to children about this, that's science. And science just rolls up our sleeves and says, okay, how? And when we get to the story of Adam and Eve naked in the garden petting tigers, it's sometimes confusing for children to go from this to evolution when they get to junior high. You got to prepare them for that. If you don't prepare kids with what I'm saying here right now, it happens. I know you've heard about it. Kids think they have to pick faith or they have to pick science. And since science is telling us so much these days, guess which one they pick? And they leave behind faith, which asks difficult, sometimes, things of them. So you got to prepare them that, no, we're just saying God made everything. God totally could have created Adam and Eve as a miracle. God could have done anything he wanted to do. Evolution looks at genes and phenotypes and changes in populations over time. Evolution is totally unequipped to ever find a single first man and first woman. So it can't prove them or disprove them. It's not even talking the same thing. They're not related. So the point, wrapping up here, the point of going through all of that, now that you've got your chemistry glasses on, and you have them now always, there's three main things that come from looking at science this way. Faith first, then study science. Science is the study of the handiwork of God. In our lives, when we are suffering, and we all suffer, right? We suffer discord in our families, we suffer illness, we suffer loss, we suffer difficult decisions, we suffer when people hurt us. I look at the periodic table to draw inspiration. Because what that says is God's got this. It's the same thing you read about in the Old Testament when the ancient Hebrews relied on the faithfulness of God. We've got even more reason today to rely on the faithfulness of God with what we know about science. Science ought to give us greater faith in God than ever before. So God's got this. If God can create all those elements since the beginning of time and hold them in existence and swirl them all together to make the trees and the clouds and the birds and the roses and the bees and the mosquitoes, which are part of God's plan, not quite understanding sometimes, if God can do all of that, and if God can hold all the elements doing what they're doing so that your body keeps functioning, I mean, we take it for granted, and that the cesium-133 hyperfine electrons keep jiggling 9 billion or more times a second. Anything that happens that we don't understand, whatever you're suffering today, we're on a path towards perfection. And since we are not at that point of perfection yet, there is necessarily going to be imperfection in the world. But God knows where he's going with all of this. We are all in this together, connected in very precise ways at the atomic level, but we're all in this together as Catholics, supposed to be leading the rest of the world to Christ. And whatever suffering you're going through, with your chemistry glasses on, tell yourself, if it helps, God's got this. Divine providence is what I'm talking about. But then the next thing is evangelize through science. We live in a modern age where in the last 200 years, which is a blip in human history, our knowledge of the atom, and hence our technology, has exploded. That is an understatement to say that it's exploded. The fact that we have mobile phones. Anybody got a cell phone in here? Have you ever thought about how those work? How you can touch the screen and something happens? How you can post a picture or you can click a heart and you can like somebody's picture from halfway around the world? It's because we can manipulate the atom and the electrons in the atom so well. You're touching solid-state devices that have very precise control of where electrons go and very precise control over what radio waves are given out there, bouncing off of satellites, traveling around the world like that. And that's because we understand the atom so well. And so I'm serious. Talk to people about this. Don't be afraid to talk. If you meet an atheist who says, I love science, how can you prove God exists? Roll your sleeves up and say, got an hour? Let me give you something in a little box above your head. Let's talk about it together. And walk with the atheist right up to that point when we have loved science together, you and me, atheists. We have loved, and I've done this a bunch of times. Walk with that atheist, love science, go along with it. There's nothing contradictory. And when the atheist says, that's where the end comes for me, they won't say it exactly like that. The biggest why of all, science is about asking why. The biggest why of all is who created all of this? If you have a mobile phone, you don't assume that it just popped into existence out of randomness. You assume somebody created it. Well, who do you think created all the materials that we make those cell phones with? So walk with the atheist. Show the atheist that you don't die a miserable death for leading a life of faith. I mean, if you're a martyr, that's because you've reached a glorious end. You're living for something. So evangelize through science. No more of this faith and science conflict. Use science to evangelize through it. We live in a scientific age. If you don't remember, and you don't want to remember all the details that we just walked through very quickly with your chemistry glasses on, it's enough to know those details are there, which is why I went through it very fast. It's enough to know those details are there, and you can people do spend entire careers as scientists trying to further those details just a little bit. So in confidence, when you pray the creed, just like JJ, I believe in God the Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. Just pray that and mean it. It's that simple, evangelizing through science. The last thing I want to say is specifically to any young people in here, or even to parents and grandparents who know young people who like science and who are thinking about becoming scientists. We need you as Catholics to be scientists. We live in a bit of a crisis right now because science has exploded so much. The scientific community, the vast number of scientists and the community consensus among scientists is that the human person is just atoms and molecules. And that has some very devastating consequences in bioethics, in vitro fertilization, even contraception, what to do, how to know when a person's dead, what to do with extra embryos created. It has devastating consequences for human life. And so if you're a young person or you know a young person who's Catholic and is thinking about studying science, encourage them to do so. I encourage you, if you're a young person, do it. We need Catholics who understand the fullness of the truth about the human person, about God the Creator, and about the fact that as humanity, we are supposed to be traveling on that journey towards perfection. We need those kind of people out there leading scientific progress. Because without that vision that grace provides you, without that vision towards Christ, that Christocentric vision, you can do anything you want in science, and just because you can, people think they should. And we really do need Catholics to be leading the way in science. We need the scientific revolution that started in the 16th and 17th century in the Christian West, in Catholic universities. We need that revolution to come complete now. Now that science has exploded, we need Catholics, and I say Catholics specifically because of our understanding of truth and God's creation and virtue. We need Catholics to lead the way back to a unity with philosophy and theology and science so that we can progress science towards a good future that benefits mankind. So with our articles of faith that come from divine revelation and we reason forth in systematic theology, remember with your chemistry glasses the particles of faith and go out there and evangelize, be open to meeting people, atheists where they are, and walking with them on that journey. Thank you all. That is all, and God bless all your atoms.